I was 17, and I had never witnessed a murder. I had never seen a corpse before, so you can imagine how I felt when I saw 64 bodies that night. 64. I'll never forget that number, and I'll never forget how they were stacked up. 8 to a pile. There were 8 piles, each one in the form of a star. One body laid lengthwise, the other across, and 2 more positioned diagonally. I saw them carefully create the piles like it was art. A wonderful art to respect the sacrifice of the 64 victims. People say that everything happens for a reason, some more secret than others, but all very much necessary. Regardless of that night changed my innocence forever, and perhaps it'll change yours. Clear Lake County is one of the most amazing places that you'd probably ever discover. It's a sleepy town where there's a local store for just about everything. Mr. Wheeler owns the bakery next to the movie theater, which is owned by Kyle Davidson, the brother of Matisse Davidson, the famous movie star, who word has it would be moving to Clear Lake this coming fall. Mrs. Peterson owns a confectionery boutique called Nibbles, which attracts people by the dozen, and during the summer she serves complimentary lemonade to her clients as they share macaroons, chocolate bundt cake, and her famous coconut balsamic cookies. Rudy's Deli, however, was by far one of the most famous shops in all of Clear Lake. During lunchtime, the queue would curl around the corner next to Alfred Adams Memorial Park, which would celebrate its centennial anniversary that summer. It was donated in 1920 by Alfred Adams, the founder of Adams Provisions, which supplied cured meats, pickles, olives, fresh vegetables, and anything else that you'd find on a typical relish tray. He donated the park so that people could have a place to convene and get to know one another. Every year, his grandson, Tristan Adams, would sponsor a weekend filled with live jazz, amusement park rides, and all the finger food you can possibly eat. People look forward to the event every single year, and this year would not disappoint. As you can probably imagine, we don't have the mega shopping centers that most large cities have. One-stop shopping just doesn't exist here, and the citizens prefer it that way. Everyone smiles with a good morning or a good afternoon. Men hold open doors for women. Women do the same for men. Profanity, offensive language, and prejudices have been replaced with love, sacrifice, honesty, and trust. Few have experienced such a brotherhood. In fact, Clearwater was written up in Ramnast magazine as being one of the safest counties in all of the country, and it didn't even have a police department. Strangely enough, there had never been a need for one. People were just genuinely nice to one another. Although it was a slice of heaven, I couldn't wait to leave and travel to the larger cities and meet other people with other interests. Traveling the country was my goal, but like many 17-year-olds with a license, I was missing a crucial part in my arrangement. I was missing a car. I found myself looking through the want ads from the daily Clear Lake Chronicle to see if I could get something for the summer. There were a few side jobs listed, but the pay was hardly fetching. Every morning, I'd walk to Emma Asher's newsstand with hopes of finding the perfect summer job, but found nothing of the sort. Days seemed to drip by, and the prospects of landing a job were quietly slipping away, and by extension, so too were the ideas of buying a car. Then, by some act of God, or, the way I see it now, an act of Satan, I saw it. Parked right out front of Rudy's Deli was an Adams Provisions delivery van with a cardboard sign stuffed between the dashboard and the windshield. It said, "Temporary driver needed," and the phone number was listed directly below. This was a perfect job. What's more perfect than paying a newly licensed teenager to drive around in a van? Sure, the van was wrapped in vinyl with pictures of hams and salamis, bologna, roast beef, and pepperoni sausages, but I didn't care. The hood was a gigantic picture of a relish tray with everything from peppers and carrots to olives and pickles. None of that concerned me. What I needed was a job, and well, this might have been my only shot at one this summer. I ran over to the newsstand to borrow a pen, and on the way back I saw the delivery driver rolling his hand truck back into the deli. I waited a few minutes and then stopped him before he reached for the driver's side door of the van. "Excuse me, sir. I was wondering if the driver position was still available, and if it was, I'd be extremely interested in filling it." He shot me an awkward smile and slowly nodded. "Yes, you're in luck, kid. Job is still available. Do you have a license?" I said yes, and I told him I'd be available immediately, if you'd like. "Well, that's not up to me, kid. You'll have to interview with Mr. Adams for that." He reached in his pocket and pulled out a business card and circled the phone number below. It was Mr. Tristan Adams' card, and I'd have to call to set up an interview. I smiled back with a thank you and briskly walked home to call him. The house was empty. My parents were at work, and so, when I arrived, I pet the dog, sat at the kitchen table, and I dialed a number. I reached the secretary, and to my surprise, she told me to come by when I had an opportunity. I was lucky, she said. Mr. Adams was unexpectedly in the office that afternoon and could see me. I didn't know it at the time, but it would be the worst day of my life. Adams Provisions was located on the very outskirts of town. Although it wasn't a huge factory, it was wildly successful. It was set against the great Pinewood Lake, whose banks dovetailed nicely into a forest that was filled with pine trees and tall shrubs, making the whole complex look picturesque. As I approached the main office, I was a bit nervous, but I self-talked any of my doubts away. After all, it was just a summer job, right? I walked in and was greeted with yet another uncomfortable smile from the secretary at the front desk. "You must be here for the temporary driver position, right? Mr. Adams has been expecting you. Come this way." Mr. Adams sat behind a large wooden desk decorated with picture frames and paperwork. He stood up with a cheerful smile and shook my hand.
"Welcome to Adams Provisions. Sit down, make yourself comfortable. So, you're here for the temporary driver's position, right? Tell me, what do you know about us? Have you heard of our organization before?"
I really didn't know what to say, although I should have prepared for a question like this. I told him what I've heard from others in town. I told him that Adams Provisions was one of the most successful companies in all of Clearwater County. I also told him that they were known for being generous and that the town was lucky to have such a company. He nodded with a smile as I spoke, and then he filled in the blanks.
"Well, yes, we've been successful pretty much ever since we started here at Clearwater. We ship our cured meats and products to places all over the country. Our brand is widely sought after, and our deli clientele are successful because of our dedication and sacrifice."
He pointed out toward the window.
"You see those railroad tracks? They lead to Pinewood Lake, and we also ship our products out by boat, and we bring raw materials in when needed. We're thankful to all of our employees because without their loyalty, we wouldn't be where we are today. Anyhow, let's talk about your new job. The driver before you was more or less your age. He worked with us for a year and a half, and then last month he just never showed up to work. We've been short one driver, and we need some part-time help until we get another one."
He extended his arm and offered me a USB drive, or at least it looked like one. I'd need it to punch in and out at the factory, and if I wanted it, I could have it.
"The job is yours if you want it."
And with a smile, I happily nodded and thanked him, and he welcomed me aboard. As you can probably imagine, I was excited to finally land a job. It was simple. I loaded the van with cold cuts, delivered them to the delis on the list, and then went home. I worked no more than 4 hours a day, and I got to drive the van home every night, which made my commute, well, free. The deli owners would tip me a few dollars to make sure that there were no shortages of roast beef, liverwurst, and bologna, the three top sellers which at times were unavailable. The worst part of the job was hosing down the back of that van, which I wound up doing in my parents' driveway. The meat always left an odd stench, and at times the roast beef would leak from its packaging, so cleaning was an everyday thing. But I didn't care. I was happy to have a job. One afternoon, after hosing down the van, I kicked back and watched TV on the sofa, and sleep just got the best of me. I woke up, looked toward the window, and quickly noticed the darkness outside. Amazing how sleep can quickly make time disappear. I got up and went toward the kitchen to fix myself a sandwich, and it was then that it hit me. I quickly reached in my pockets, and inside was that small USB gadget that I used to punch in and out. The same one that I was clearly instructed to leave at the office after punching out in the afternoon. Having that in my pocket was a clear indication that I had not punched out for the day, and although Adam's provisions were generous, they were incredibly strict with the daily logging in and out. You were severely docked if you didn't do either one correctly. I looked at the clock and it was only 11:20. I had 40 minutes to make it right. 40 minutes to get back into the factory and punch out. If I knew then what I know now, I would have never set foot back in that place again. It was one of the worst decisions of my young life. I grabbed the keys off the counter, started the van, and headed to Pinewood Lake. The road to Pinewood Lake looks quite different at night than it does during the mornings. At night, the road was unlit. There was no one in front of me or behind me, and the forest seemed to limit the amount of moonlight. It was downright creepy. It was amazing how such a picturesque place transformed itself into what seemed fitting for a horror movie. My discomfort was growing into fright, and I quickly became paranoid. Strangely, I anticipated the headlights shining on something appearing out of the sides of the forest. It was all in my mind. In fact, the only shadows that I would see that night were the ones from the gates as I approached the driveway of the factory. I pulled up, unlocked the gate, and drove toward the main entrance. As I parked the van, I noticed that there was a light coming from an open door toward the back of the factory, next to the train tracks that led toward the river. It was almost midnight, and there shouldn't have been any lights or any doors open. The first shift starts at 5:30 in the morning, and that was a long way away. I shut the headlights and slowly walked toward the open door. I walked up the stairs toward the office where I usually punched out from. The office was like a bird's nest that overlooked the whole factory and all its glorious machinery. It was common to see Tristan Adams oddly standing there for long lengths of time, watching over his workers. Tonight, however, there were only two sections of the factory that were lit up. I stood there, just like Mr. Adams, looking around for a few minutes. And then the horror came. The horror came into the light. The horror came into the factory in a large covered steel cart that rolled up on the rails. There were four men who approached it. One removed the tarp, and the others reached in to grab what seemed like heavy, long bags. It took two men to unload each bag. There were four of them. One handled the front while the other grabbed the opposite end. They placed the bags onto a flat aluminum trolley, and they wheeled it toward the lit part of the factory, the part nearest to me. The light shined directly onto the bags, and what happened next made me weak in the knees and almost made me vomit. I would never be able to unsee what I saw. To my horror, I saw a human foot appear from the end of one of those bags. It dropped and dragged along the floor, exposing the leg it was attached to. The men casually stopped the trolley, placed it back on, and continued. They stopped shortly ahead where two men in black jumpsuits were waiting. The men unloaded the bags and placed them on the floor, and then they went back toward the rails where they had started. The men in jumpsuits unzipped the bags and revealed what I dreadfully suspected. Inside each bag were naked corpses. They casually slid each of the bags off, revealing them. As they unzipped the final bag, They both let out a guttural scream. A naked man sat up and reached toward the floor to try to escape his fate. He fell off the trolley and struggled to get out of the half-unzipped bag, like a fish trying to violently escape its net. One of the men reached into his jumpsuit and pulled out a baton, and with one hard strike to the back of the head, the man stopped his struggle and laid calmly on the factory floor. I stepped back so as not to be seen by anyone. I knew I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I certainly wanted no part of this. I wanted to leave, run, but I knew I couldn't go down the stairs. In fact, the slightest movement would give me away. And I suspected that I had seen too much for me to be let go, so I stepped back and continued to watch. The men in jumpsuits started to shave the hair off the corpses using clippers for the long hair and then blades for the eyebrows and facial. Once clean, they would be stacked 8 to a pile in a star formation. One body laid lengthwise, the other placed across, the other 2 positioned diagonally from either end. They repeated the pattern twice to form the pile. From above, it looked as if they were creating an art form. The symmetry was perfect, as if they'd done it before. I stood in horror, but I couldn't shut my eyes for fear that someone would creep up the stairs and grab me. So I kept them open, and I was forced to watch as they created 7 more piles. It was 3:15 in the morning, and from above, I stared down and looked at 8 piles of corpses, 64 bodies. Then, all the men in the factory stopped for a moment. They all silently convened next to the piles, and then they all looked up toward me. And that's when I almost fainted. I couldn't step back any further. My back was against the wall already. There was nowhere left to go. Had they known that I was watching them the whole time? Well, the fact was that they didn't know. They were all looking up at Mr. Tristan Adams, who stood just a few feet to my left. He, too, was staring at me. Had he been there the whole time? My fright drained the blood out of my face, and my chest felt hollow. My arms and hands tingled like I was about to pass out. He approached me and placed his arm around my shoulder and then smiled. We have a lot to talk about. The men below looked up at him as if he were a king. The artful sacrifice would be for him to enjoy. Then Tristan Adams took a step forward toward the railing and said,
Let us be thankful for the cleansing that has happened tonight. And like always, we are thankful for those who are corrupt and those who offend. We are thankful for those who are immoral and unpleasant. And we are grateful to today's sacrifice and the purity that continues in Clear Lake County and the counties that are now participating with us.
And just like that, the machine started and the factory started to hum. Each of the men seemed to have a responsibility. They would use a hydraulic lift and place the naked shaved corpses on a conveyor belt that rose toward a large opening, or what the factory workers generally referred to as the feeder. One by one, each corpse dropped into the machine, creating a grisly noise that sounded like gravel being tossed and crushed. The sound haunts me today, and I think that it'll never leave my mind. Mr. Adams smiled and asked me to follow him into his office. I sat back in the same chair where I was interviewed. It had been one horrifying full circle. He leaned back and spoke to me as if everything was normal. He spoke to me the same way he did on the first day I met him.
Adams Provisions has been successful not only in what it produces, but what it provides. There's a reason why Clear Lake is the way it is. Have you ever wondered why we don't have a police department? Those who respect one another and are inherently good remain. Those who get out of hand do so for the very last time. This has been happening for generations, and as you can see, the counties around us are more and more starting to resemble clearly. They too understand the sacrifice. Doctors do it all the time. They cut the cancer out before it affects the body, and we do the same for our county. Cured meats is the way we respect the sacrifice of the corrupt, the hateful, and the unpleasant. Our recipe is a great one. It transforms what's undesirable into something much more palatable. Delis are packed with unbeknownst citizens who chew their sandwiches with pleasure, and it will remain that way. So, you have a choice. You can choose to go the way of the driver you recently replaced, or you can choose to become part of our family, a family you'll grow to love.
After a few minutes of thinking, I gained a new family. I would agree to know something and say nothing. As months went on, the initial smell of cold cuts being unwrapped would make me gag, and I completely stopped having any cured meats, no matter what company it came from. I couldn't get the images of the corpses and the grinding sounds they made inside those machines. At that very second, Sheriff Carter stopped me in disbelief. He had heard enough, and he was stricken with disgust and anger. He got up and went to a glass-enclosed office nearest to the desk we were both sitting at. I saw him motion angrily and even heard a muffled outburst as he paced the room with his telephone. Sheriff Carter was known to be a stern and honest lawman, and it was a shame that he belonged to another state. He opened the door and walked toward me and told me that this horror would come to an end. He thanked me for my efforts. He thanked me for my confession. He thanked me for the 6 hours that it took me to drive to his state. And then he dialed a number on his cell phone and handed it to me. On the other end was Mr. Adams. He calmly said that we'd have a lot to talk about when I arrived back at the factory, and that Sheriff Carter was a fast but safe driver, and that I shouldn't hit a lot of traffic. His disturbing words shuddered my soul. I'm now in what seems to be an interrogation room, which is where I'm recording this, and it's where I'm awaiting my fate. I'm hoping this recording reaches your inbox. I'm hoping you'll tell my story.